Of all the names you can call a person, there's one that's designed not just to insult, but to erase, to reduce your entire identity, your love, your very presence in someone's life down to a single ugly transaction. Gold digger. I remember the first time I heard my mother-in-law say it. We were at a family dinner in their ridiculously opulent dining room, and she didn't even have the decency to whisper it. She said it to my husband, her son, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Well, Alex," she'd said with a tight, cruel smile, "at least you married someone who understands the value of our family's hard work." He'd frozen, and she'd looked right at me, her eyes like chips of ice, and the unspoken words hung in the air between us. Gold digger. They thought it was my weakness, a label they could use to control me, to remind me that I was an outsider who should be grateful for the scraps from their table. They had no idea it would become my weapon. They made our entire relationship about money. They were so obsessed with protecting their bank account from me, they never once imagined that I was the one they should have been protecting it for. Because a few months after that night, at another family dinner, I sat at that same table, looked that same woman in the eye, and with a few quiet words and one perfectly timed email, I drained every last cent from their accounts, and I did it without breaking a single law. If you want to know how, then stay with me. This isn't a story about stealing money. It's a story about collecting a debt. My name is Amelia, and I'm a forensic accountant. I spend my days tracing numbers through complex corporate structures to find what people are trying to hide. I find patterns in the chaos. It's a job that requires patience, precision, and an eye for details that others miss. It's not a job you do for the glory. You do it because you believe in the truth, and you know that numbers, unlike people, never lie. When I met Alex, numbers were the last thing on my mind. He was a resident at the hospital where my firm was conducting an audit. He was kind, brilliant, funny, and he had this way of looking at me that made me feel like I was the only person in the room. He came from money, I knew that. The Sterling family was practically royalty in our city. They owned Sterling Enterprises, a massive, generations-old manufacturing empire. But Alex was different. He had no interest in the family business. He wanted to be a surgeon, to help people. He was grounded and real, and I fell for him hard. I come from a very different world. My parents are retired school teachers. We had love and laughter and books, but we never had money. I worked my way through college, took out loans for my master's degree, and was proud of the life I was building for myself. When Alex introduced me to his parents, Charles and Eleanor Sterling, I was nervous, but I was also hopeful. I thought they would see the woman their son loved. Instead, they saw a balance sheet. They saw my modest background as a liability, a threat to their pristine family legacy. From the very beginning, it was a Cold War fought with passive aggression. Eleanor would compliment my dress by saying, "It's amazing what you can find at those department stores these days." Charles would ask about my job and then say with a dismissive chuckle, "So, you're like a bookkeeper. Quaint." They never asked about my passions, my dreams, my family. They only asked questions that allowed them to measure my worth in dollars and cents, and I always came up short. Alex, bless his heart, was caught in the middle. He saw their behavior, and it pained him. "They're just from a different generation, Ames," he'd say after every disastrous dinner. "They're protective. Once they get to know you, they'll love you." But they never tried to get to know me. To them, I wasn't a person. I was a potential merger, and my financials were not up to par. The breaking point, the moment the Cold War turned hot, was at their 40th wedding anniversary party. It was a huge, extravagant affair at their country club, hundreds of guests. Charles got up to make a speech. He thanked his friends, his business partners, and then he turned to his son. "And to my son, Alex," he said, raising his glass, "who has made me so proud and who has brought a lovely young woman into our lives." He paused and looked over at me. Amelia has taught us all a valuable lesson that it's important to appreciate the finer things in life, even if you've never had them before. The room was filled with a ripple of uncomfortable laughter. I felt my face flush hot with shame. It was a toast that was also an insult, wrapped in a tuxedo. But his wife, Eleanor, she was the one who delivered the fatal blow. Later that evening, she found me alone by the terrace. She glided up to me, her diamonds glittering, and she said, "I hope you're not getting too comfortable, dear. Just so you know, our assets are in an ironclad trust. We have the best lawyers in the country. The sterling money is for sterlings." She patted my arm, a gesture that was meant to feel like a threat, and then she finished with the word that had been hanging in the air for years. "We just want to make sure there are no gold diggers in the family." That was it. The mask was off. The polite fiction we had all been maintaining was gone. I wasn't family. I was a threat, a gold digger. I looked for Alex, and I saw him across the room, trapped in a conversation, oblivious, and in that moment, I felt utterly and completely alone. I went home that night and I cried. I cried for the humiliation, for the cruelty, but as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the forensic accountant in me started to wake up. The part of me that sees patterns, the part of me that knows how to find what people are trying to hide. They had drawn the battle lines, and they had made it about money, about their precious, ironclad sterling fortune. An idea, cold and sharp, began to form in my mind. They were so focused on protecting their money from me, it never occurred to them that their biggest threat wasn't a gold digger trying to get in, but a forensic accountant they had just pushed out. They wanted to talk about assets. Fine, let's talk about assets. The first rule of forensic accounting is you never start by looking for a crime. You start by looking for a story. What story are the numbers trying to tell you? My in-laws had made it clear that their company, Sterling Enterprises, was their pride and joy, the source of their immense wealth. So that's where I started. It wasn't about revenge, not at first. It was about understanding the empire they held so dear, the fortress they were so desperate to protect from me. As a publicly traded company, many of their financial statements were public record. I spent a week of late nights poring over their quarterly reports, their shareholder statements, their investment summaries. It all looked perfect, too perfect. Profits were steady, growth was consistent, dividends were paid on time. But there was a recurring anomaly I couldn't ignore. A series of massive, multi-million-dollar consulting fees paid out every quarter to a single, obscure entity, Argent Holdings, LLC. Argent Holdings. The name meant nothing. It wasn't a known consulting firm. It had no public profile, no website. To any normal auditor, it might look like a standard if expensive business expense. But to me, it was a loose thread, and my entire career was built on pulling loose threads. I used my firm's resources to do a deep dive on Argent Holdings. It was a shell corporation, registered in a state known for its lax business privacy laws. But I kept digging, peeling back the layers of corporate anonymity, and after 3 long nights fueled with coffee and a burning sense of injustice, I found it. The sole registered agent, the owner of Argent Holdings LLC, was a man named Charles Sterling, my father-in-law. My heart hammered in my chest. This was it. This was the story the numbers were telling. My father-in-law had created a ghost company and was using it to siphon millions of dollars out of his own publicly traded family business. He was paying himself massive consulting fees from the main company, essentially stealing from his own shareholders. This wasn't just unethical, it was felony-level fraud and tax evasion. The ironclad sterling fortune wasn't just protected by lawyers, it was being illegally inflated by a secret, fraudulent scheme. But who was he stealing from? I looked at the list of major shareholders. The Sterling family owned 51%. The other 49% was a mix of institutional investors, and there it was. A 10% stake was owned by a man named Richard Sterling, Charles's younger brother. I remembered Alex telling me stories about his uncle Richard. He was the creative genius behind their most successful product lines, but Charles, the ruthless businessman, had forced him out of the company's leadership team a decade ago. Richard had kept his shares but had been estranged from the family ever since. Charles wasn't just stealing from anonymous investors. He was stealing from his own brother. This was the weapon, a nuclear bomb of financial ruin. I could go to the SEC, I could go to the IRS, I could destroy him. But if I did that, the company would collapse. The stock would be worthless, and Alex, my innocent husband, would be caught in the fallout. His name, his family, would be dragged through the mud. I couldn't do that to him.
So I looked for another way, a more precise way. I kept digging into Argent Holdings. How was it funded? How did the money move? And that's when I found the second piece of the puzzle, the key. Argent Holdings was a cash-hungry beast used to fund Charles's risky side investments and the lavish lifestyle. To keep it liquid, Charles had secured a massive revolving line of credit with a private investment bank. The loan was for $50 million, and the collateral for this loan, it was everything. I found the loan documents in a public filing. The collateral wasn't just his shares in Sterling Enterprises. It was every personal asset he and Eleanor owned, their Park Avenue mansion, their summer home in the Hamptons, their art collection, their entire personal investment portfolio. They had leveraged every last penny of their personal wealth to secure the fraudulent activities of their secret company. They were living in a palace built on a mountain of debt, one phone call away from total collapse. I had my plan. It was surgical. It was precise, and it was perfectly legal. I wouldn't be the one to pull the trigger. I would simply hand the loaded gun to the one person in the world who had every right to use it. I spent a weekend compiling my findings into a single, undeniable dossier. Every fraudulent transfer, every hidden document, every bank statement. I printed it all out, put it in a secure courier envelope with no return address, and I sent it to one person, Richard Sterling. I included a short, anonymous note. You were cheated. The proof is in here. The collateral for Argent Holdings' line of credit is your brother's entire personal net worth. Act accordingly. And then I waited. I didn't have to wait long. About a month later, my mother-in-law called. Her voice was syrupy sweet. Amelia, darling, we're having a small family dinner on Saturday. Just us. We'd love for you and Alex to come. It was a command disguised as an invitation. I knew this was it. The stage was set. We'd love to, Eleanor, I said, my voice perfectly calm. We'll be there. The dinner was about to begin. The evening felt like a scene from a play I had seen 100 times. We arrived at the Sterling mansion, the air thick with the scent of lilies and smug satisfaction. Charles was booming, expansive, pouring vintage wine. Eleanor was gliding around in a new silk dress, making pointed remarks about the cost of everything. They were performing their favorite roles, the untouchable patriarch and matriarch of the Sterling dynasty. They thought they had won. They had put the little gold digger in her place, and now she was back at their table, suitably chastened. They had no idea they were the guests of honor at their own execution. I was quiet through the appetizers. I sipped my water, smiled politely, and listened to Charles pontificate about a new acquisition. Alex, sensing my quietness, squeezed my hand under the table. He thought I was still hurt, still intimidated. He had no idea I was a hunter, patiently waiting for the trap to spring. The main course was served, a beautiful roasted lamb. Charles stood up to carve it, a grand theatrical gesture he loved. And just as he raised the carving knife, his phone, sitting on the sideboard, began to buzz, a frantic, insistent vibration. He ignored it. It buzzed again and again. With an annoyed huff, he put the knife down and answered it. "What?" he barked into the phone. I watched his face, and it was the most satisfying thing I have ever seen. The color drained from it instantly. The ruddy, confident complexion turned to a pasty, sickly gray. His eyes went wide with a horror so profound it seemed to suck all the air out of the room. He stumbled back a step, gripping the sideboard for support. "What do you mean, frozen?" Whispered into the phone. "What injunction? All of them? That's not possible." Eleanor rushed to his side. "Charles, what is it? What's wrong?" He couldn't speak. He just stared into space, the phone clattering from his hand onto the marble floor. At that moment, his other phone, his personal cell, began to ring. Then Eleanor's phone lit up. Then the house landline, a symphony of destruction. I knew exactly what was happening. Uncle Richard had received my package, and being the shrewd, wronged man that he was, he hadn't just filed a lawsuit. He'd gone to the bank that held the $50 million line of credit for Argent Holdings. He'd presented them with the undeniable proof of massive, ongoing fraud connected to their loan. A bank's worst nightmare. Faced with the evidence, the bank's risk department would have acted instantly and ruthlessly to protect themselves. They would have triggered the emergency clause in the loan agreement. They froze everything. Every account, every asset, every line of credit tied to Charles and Eleanor Sterling. And because their entire personal fortune was the collateral, it was all gone, locked away pending the outcome of a lawsuit they couldn't possibly win. Their credit card was declined when she tried to call their lawyer back. Charles's private banker wasn't taking his calls. Their vast, untouchable fortune had vanished in the span of a single phone call. Their bank account had been drained. The room was in chaos. Eleanor was on the verge of hysterics. Alex had rushed to his father's side, trying to understand what was happening. I just sat there, calmly taking a bite of my lamb. And then, through the panic, Charles looked at me. His eyes, filled with dawning terror, locked onto mine. There was no proof, no connection, no way he could ever trace it back to me, but he knew. In that moment, he knew that the quiet little bookkeeper he had dismissed, the gold digger he had insulted, had somehow brought his entire empire crashing down around him. I met his gaze, and I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just gave him a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, and then I raised my glass of water, as if in a toast. "Is something wrong, Charles? You look like you've seen a ghost." The aftermath was a slow, agonizing collapse. The lawsuit from Richard was brutal and swift. The evidence was irrefutable. The SEC launched a full investigation. To avoid criminal charges, Charles and Eleanor had to settle, and settling meant liquidating everything. The mansion was the first to go, then the Hamptons house. The art collection was auctioned off at a fraction of its value. Their stock portfolio was seized. By the time they were done paying the bank, the government, and the massive settlement to Richard, the great Sterling fortune was little more than a memory. They ended up in a small, rented townhouse on the other side of the city. Charles, his reputation destroyed, was forced into a quiet, humiliating retirement. Eleanor, stripped of her diamonds and her status, seemed to shrink, becoming a frail, bitter old woman. The power they had wielded, the arrogance they had worn like a crown, was gone. My marriage to Alex was tested. He was devastated by his family's downfall. For a while, he was angry, confused. He never directly accused me, but the question hung in the air between us. "Did you know?" he asked me one night. I looked him in the eye, and I told him the truth. Not the whole truth, but the part that mattered. "I knew they were cruel to me, Alex. I knew they would never respect me. They made our life about money. They called me a gold digger. All I did was decide to believe them and step out of the way." It was the closest I would ever come to a confession. And in time, he understood. He saw that his parents' ruin was not caused by me, but by their own greed and arrogance. I had simply held up a mirror, and the reflection had shattered them. Our marriage survived. In fact, it became stronger. Freed from the toxic shadow of his parents, Alex became his own man. We built a life together not based on his family's name, but on our own partnership. The lesson I learned was one they could never have taught me. My worth was never in their bank account. It wasn't in their approval or their acceptance. My worth was in my mind, in my skills, in my refusal to be devalued. They thought my background was my weakness, but it was my strength. It taught me resilience. They thought my job was quaint, but it gave me the power to see the truth they had hidden from the world. I left my job and started my own consulting firm, specializing in financial ethics and corporate transparency. I became incredibly successful. I now teach corporations how to avoid the very kind of ruinous behavior my father-in-law had perfected. We don't see the Sterlings anymore. There's too much history, too much pain. But a few months ago, I received a small, handwritten note in the mail. It was from Eleanor. Inside was a faded photograph of a young Alex, maybe 5 or 6 years old, smiling on a tricycle. The note said only one thing. He was so happy then. Thank you for still loving him. It wasn't an apology. Not really. But it was an acknowledgement. A concession. A final quiet admission that the thing she had tried so hard to protect, her money, her legacy, was worthless compared to the one thing she had almost lost, her son's happiness. They called me a gold digger because they thought love could be bought. In the end, it was I who taught them that some things, like dignity and truth, have a price you can't afford to pay.